morning. If I have not met you, my name is Tracie Little, and it is my honor to serve as Canon to the Ordinary in the Diocese of Eastern Michigan. And it is such a joy to be here with you today, even as this is such a difficult day for some. I bring you greetings from Bishop Singh and from all of the bishop's staff on both dioceses. And again, I'm so happy to be here with you. Kurt, I know that you made a difficult announcement yesterday and that all of you heard that difficult announcement. And so I'm here, in part, as a response to that, to listen, and I'll be meeting with the vestry afterwards. If you're not on the vestry and you would like to talk to me, I'm happy to hang around before we meet with, I think I'm happy to hang around with before we meet with vestry. I don't know what I go where I'm told. I sit where I'm told. I carry microphones in my hand because I don't have pockets. I think that of all of the Gospels, John is my favorite. John has a way of speaking that engages us on so very many levels. In today's story, we have physical blindness, a man who could not see anything from the time that he was born. And we see in that story that his eyes are opened. We hear in this story of a different kind of blindness. At the end of the story, Jesus says some things that might be a little confusing. I came so that the blind might see and that those with sight may become blind. All kinds of different levels of understanding the difference between sight and no sight. As I was pondering that this week and thinking about the darkness that happens when we're blind. Have you ever gone into a deep cave, a mining cave, like you had to take an elevator down, it took about 7 years to get to the bottom, and then they opened the door, and they just told you to just stand still, and then they turn the lights out. You've been in that place? Dark is dark, right? I didn't know darkness could be so dark. You really can't see anything, not even your hand if you put it in front of your face. It is dark. I was thinking about that story as I remembered being a young girl in high school. I come from Canada, and mortgages work very differently in Canada. I discovered this when I bought my house, and I could buy my mortgage for 30 years, all at the same time. And my mother kept saying to me, but it renews. When does it renew? It doesn't renew. Yeah, it does. It has to renew. You better go ask some questions. It came from a dark time in our history. As a young girl going to Girl Guide camp, everything changed that summer. And my parents' mortgage was renewing, and mortgage rates had jumped to over 20%. As I got on the bus to go up to my summer job at the end of June, and I wasn't coming home until the end of August, I didn't know where I was going home to. I didn't know if we would be in the home that I had been in for a few years, or if we would be living somewhere else, who knows where. It was a pretty dark time. This was a camp when I had my very first powerful experience of God. It was the first time in my life that I had slept under the stars. And in northern Ontario, quite close to Algonquin Park, if you know where that is, there's very little light pollution. I didn't sleep that night, staring at the awe and the wonder of stars that I didn't even know existed. Those stars were so bright and so beautiful. And it was in that moment that I wondered about the power of a God who could create all of this. That summer, I was so consumed with the unknown, so weighed down by the situation that I had no control over, wondering what I was going home to. I called my mom that summer, and she said, "Who is this?" She was embarrassed when I told her it was me. "It's your daughter? Remember me? I live with you sometimes." The stress had shut her ears, just as the stress had closed down my soul a little bit, and I couldn't experience the presence and the power of this magnificent God. It was a tough go. Sometimes in our life, when we're weighed down with stress, or when we're consumed with the unknown and not knowing where we're going to be, something closes our eyes to being able to witness and experience the presence of God. It's kind of a normal and natural thing. We get so keyed up and tied up with what we don't know, that we don't remember that God is with us. There's something that happens in today's story. I thought about it as I was driving up, and I was driving due east. And do you know what I saw? A blinding sun. A sun so bright, it was below my visor. You know when it's like that? It was so bright. And I thought about that man who had been born blind as he washes the muck that Jesus made out of his spit and dirt and smeared on his eyes. I thought about how it must have been like to open those eyes for the first time and to experience the sight of a blinding sun. It washed over his eyes in a way that awakened him. It melted into his soul, and he experienced something he had never experienced before. But he didn't quite know what it was, did he? Remember what happened as the story goes on and on? How does Jesus get described? What happened to your eyes, say the powerful authorities? The man called Jesus, right? And as he articulates his story over and over and over again, his understanding of who Jesus is and what happened to him deepens. The man called Jesus becomes a prophet and a man sent from God. His story never changed. Did you notice that? Not once did his story change, even though the people kept saying to him, "This can't be true." He held his ground, and he spoke his truth. And as he practiced speaking the words that changed his life, his relationship with God came into better focus. I think it's in those moments as we share our stories that it becomes more clear to us, right? When we tell people what God means to us, or when we share a God, what I call a God story, those are stories like you know the ones where God shows up in your life and it's a complete surprise. For me that summer, it was getting the phone call or making the phone call home that went something like this: "Everything's okay." My mother, who had been a stay-at-home mother my entire whole life, went and found a job. She worked as a church secretary and she was a darn good one, for years and years and years and years and years, and it changed her. It changed me too, because with both of my parents out of the house and I got home earlier from school, guess who had to learn to cook? On a stove, I knew how to cook on a fire. My dad used to tell me I could cook better on a fire than I did on a stove. That was a challenge. Learn to cook on a stove. And I can, and I did. And it was in those moments of learning to cook that I began to taste what it means to be in relationship with God. You know, when you add spices to food, it changes the flavor. I used to have competitions with my father. It was so much fun. We used to make spaghetti sauce from scratch. So if it was my turn, I would spice it, and it was his job to tell me what spices I used. And if he did it, it was the same thing. I had to, without seeing what spices went in, to taste them. I began to taste what it means to be in relationship with God. And as I grew and I began to tell my story of faith, my story of how God has shown up in my life, my understanding about my relationship with God deepened. And those stories that were melted into my soul helped me to understand who I am as a child of God. Times of transition and change are hard, right? Faced with the unknown, we sometimes don't know where we are. We don't know who we are. We don't know who God is to us. And yet times of transition open us up to something else. In the story that Pam read this morning, at the very end of that story, the man who had been born blind and now could see was cast out, sent away. His truth, God's truth, was too much for people to understand and to bear. Jesus caught wind of that. And what does he do? You know what he did. What does it say? You have cheat sheets. You can open them. He hightails it back to town. Jesus hightails it back to town to find this man because he wasn't going to leave him alone. And in the same way, God is doing that very same thing here in this time of transition. In this time of transition, we will all walk together as we discover who you are for God and what God wants to do in this next season of ministry. And just as God dwells with us, God will dwell with Kurt as he moves and as he starts a new call and as he begins to discover who God is with those people. God doesn't abandon us. God is there opening our eyes all of the time. And in this time of transition, I'll be inviting you to tell stories. Tell your story of God in your life as individuals and in your life as a community of faith. And as we practice telling those stories, I suspect, I don't suspect, I know beyond the shadow of a doubt that as we articulate our stories, they will become deeper and deeper our truth. And our relationship with God and who you are as a community of faith will begin to emerge in a new way. And we will never be alone because every single moment of this journey, Jesus is here. And Jesus never abandons us. And so as we practice, as people who have perhaps been blind to our own stories of faith, we practice and those emerge. And they burn into our soul. And they come out with our voice as we give witness to the love and the strength and the peace and the challenge and the growth that are part of God's reality.